earthly reputation up to the heavenly. Now our lesson today is going to start in verse 22. That was an extremely quick recap. We're going to read in verse 19 to get into verse 22, make sure we have the context. So I want to pause there. So that was a summary of the previous class. Anything anybody wants to add or any questions or thoughts on that? So let's read together Matthew chapter 6, verse 19, and we'll read through verse 24 together. Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal, but lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven where neither moth nor rust destroys and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. And verse 22 is the focus of this morning's class. The eye is the lamp of the body. So if your eye is healthy, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is bad, your whole body will be full of darkness. If then the light in you is darkness, how great is the darkness? No one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. So, verse 22. As Jesus has been challenging everybody, he challenged them with their attitudes and actions, and now he challenges us on our focus. He challenges us to focus on heavenly treasure, not earthly treasure. And now he challenges us to think about what our eye is doing. So, one of my notes. When we think about the eye, Jesus is not just saying, focus on what you're looking at. The eye has a bigger symbolic meaning. Now, throughout the Bible, one of the common writing devices is people using different body parts to denote action. So when we read the Bible and we read the stories and narratives of the Bible, it isn't as action descriptive as a lot of our modern books are. So if you read a modern book, it's going to say the character stood up from their soft chair and paced slowly across the floor. They went to the door and slowly turned the doorknob, and the hinges creaked as he opened it. And a lot of description, We don't see that kind of action description in the Bible. It's pretty succinct. He got up and he went. The Bible writers tell us what people do, but they don't really describe the sights and the sounds and everything else that our modern novels do. In some of our novels, it might spend 3 pages describing how somebody feels sitting on a couch. Just tons of overflowing description, all sorts of details about what the chairs look like, the texture, the color, and so on. You don't have that kind of description in the Bible because it is not necessary. The Bible is a story of a spiritual history, and you don't need to know all the details about what the chariot sounded like, or how heavy the sword was, or how big the building was. You don't need to know that to know the spiritual history. So, when you do read about some descriptive action in the Bible, it's usually very significant. And the Bible writers will often refer to motion of the body to denote a larger action. So you'll often see, and look at this, especially as we read the Old Testament, look for these action words. They might say, his feet turned and went. When it says his feet turned and went, it's not describing what they're doing with the feet. That denotes there's going to be a bigger motion here. It's going to be significant action. Often, he opened his mouth and spoke. You'll read those terms. Turn to Matthew chapter 5, verse 2. It says, and he opened his mouth and taught them. So the Bible writer, Matthew, could have said, Jesus spoke these words, but he says he opened his mouth and spoke. So you'll often see he did something with his body and he did this. You'll often see he lifted his hands and did this. He turned his feet and went. He opened his mouth and spoke. Now often we'll also read about the eyes. He opened his eyes and beheld. He's not describing, I'm just going to look over here. He's describing this is a moment of significance where somebody observed something that was impactful. He saw something that was motivating or shocking or alarming or something like that. So all that being said, we got to think differently about how the Bible uses descriptive action than we do if we're reading a novel or a newspaper article or something like that. Everybody with me there? Different writing style, different literary devices. And when we read that, we need to think, okay, something big is happening here. So Matthew chapter 5, verse 2, it says, Jesus opened his mouth and spoke. That is more significant than saying Jesus said these words. See what I'm getting at? What does that have to do with the eye? Getting back to the eye. Let's reread Matthew 6, verse 22. It says, the eye is the lamp of the body. So if your eye is healthy, your whole body will be full of light. Well, we know that your physical health is not dependent on your eye health. We know people that have challenged vision, that are perfectly healthy in body, perfectly healthy in mind. So Jesus isn't saying that you have to have good eyesight to get to heaven. Jesus isn't saying you have to have good eyesight to be physically healthy. The eye here, going back to what I was just describing about the narrative, when we read the eye, that is, kind of a cliche, but that's the window into the brain, into the soul. So I like how the author of the book puts it here at the top of page 2 in the book. The eyes illuminate the body, which allows the coordination of the hands and feet to perform needed tasks. That's a true description. We think about what the eye does to help coordinate spiritually as well. So when we read about action description in the Bible, the eye observing something, character is observing something that is significant. Likewise, our eye is a lamp, and what we focus on could be very significant. What we focus our eye on sets direction for our hands and feet and our mind. So, again, a lot of symbolism here talking about what we intake. Throughout this lesson, think about that phrase, garbage in, garbage out, right? I think everybody's heard that. Our eyes could be the first line of defense for garbage in. It is what we focus on. And again, keeping with the spirit of the rest of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is not talking about one time looking at something. He's not saying don't look at things that you shouldn't look at. This is more like an overall way of living. So, because the rest of this is talking about heart trouble, really. It is what impact does your eye have on the heart and what we focus on. If your eye is focused on earthly treasure, then your heart is also going to be focused on earthly treasure. So the eye guides the heart. So let's turn to Psalm 119 and read about the heart a little bit and the eyes. Psalm 119. And this psalm reveals some of our focus. Psalm 119, beginning in verse 9. How can a young man keep his way pure? By guarding it according to your word. With my whole heart I seek you. Let me not wander from your commandments. To be pure, you have to guard yourself. To be pure, you have to seek God with your whole heart, not just occasionally. If our heart is directed by our eye and our heart is going to be seeking God with a whole heart, then we can't just have glances from time to time at the Bible with our eye. Just glances at good won't fully direct the heart. And then in verse 18 of Psalm 119 also, open my eyes that I may behold wondrous things out of your law. So the writer prays for open eyes to behold wondrous things out of the law. So again, open our eyes and seek God with a whole heart. Also, let's turn to Ephesians chapter 1 and read about an attitude that Paul describes. Ephesians chapter 1. In verse 15, Paul writes, "For this reason, because I have heard of your faith in the Lord Jesus and your love towards all saints, I do not cease to give thanks for you, remembering you in my prayers." So Paul is praying continuously without ceasing for the Ephesians. That's the context. Continuing in verse 17, "That the God of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of glory, may give you the spirit of wisdom and of revelation in the knowledge of him, having the eyes of your hearts enlightened, that you may know what is the hope to which he has called you." So Paul is praying continuously for the Ephesians, and one of the things that he is praying for is that their eyes of their hearts will be enlightened. So here that ties the two together. If we're going to be pure with God, we have to seek God with our whole heart. If we're going to seek God with our whole heart, we need to have the eyes of our heart enlightened and the eyes of our heart opened so that we could intake the good things. So we often focus about what not to look at, the obvious things there. Well, one of the things that Jesus is getting at with the rest of Scriptures is what your eye should look at. Not look at these books and read these good books, you could learn more, but focus on pure, holy things. Again, the eye symbol is not just about what we look at, but what we focus on and how we direct our heart. Let's also turn to Colossians chapter 3. Just went through a really good series with Donnie on that. I missed him this morning, but appreciate all of his insightful classes on Colossians we've been going through the past several weeks. Colossians 3 verses 2. "Set your minds on things that are above, not on things that are on earth." So if we're going to set our minds on things that are above, then our eyes need to be focused on those good things. Our eye directs the mind. And then turn back a page or two to Philippians chapter 4, verse 8. Something we're all very familiar with. "Finally, brothers, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is commendable, if there is any excellence, if there is anything worthy of praise, think about these things," or meditate. I like the translations that say meditate on these things better. So if we're going to meditate on things that are pure and holy, that means we set our eye on them and we focus on them. And then we don't take our eye off of this thing. So if we're going to avoid the heart trouble that causes all the issues, both with the attitude and the improper actions that Jesus challenges us on chapters 5 and 6, then we need to have our eyes set on the right thing to avoid those heart problems. Any comments, discussion on these points? Don't let me lecture the whole time. So think about which way we want our lives to take. If we want to walk with God, then we need to set our heart on God. And we can't set our heart on God if our eyes are wandering all over the place. We become what we think. So that really sets our direction. That's kind of the steering wheel in a way. Let's turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 10. Verse 31. 1 Corinthians 10 verses 31. "So whatever you eat or drink or whatever you do, do all to the glory of God." So we need to have a purpose in our heart if we're going to do all to the glory of God. Again, we got to direct our eyes towards what will help us do that and direct our eyes away from what will distract from that vision. Going back to Matthew chapter 6, verse 22, 23. Verse 22, I think we've covered that, talked about our whole body will be full of light if our eye is healthy. Now let's think about verse 23. "But if your eye is bad, your whole body will be full of darkness." So again, not talking about physical vision impairment or blindness. But you think about people that are, just not focused on healthy things. Somebody that's, glued to the TV nonstop. Your life is going to be affected by everything that you watch. Watching all the doom and gloom news all the time, that's going to take away your focus on God and the ultimate victory. Movies, video games, nothing wrong with those, but if that's all your focus, then your direction for your life is going to be seeking out that kind of escapism. And there's some people that will spend more time, in a fantasy world than thinking about the real world. The same thing with sports. Now, nothing wrong with news or movies or games or sports, but if that's all that you're intaking, that's going to direct your mind to be focusing on those things. Year with football coming on, I think we could all imagine how consuming that could be, and some people that it's all that they talk about, and you can't think about anything but what you're watching on TV. So let's make sure that we don't let our spiritual eyesight get bad by focusing on those things and not giving the right amount of attention to God's Word and focusing on the good things. So some specifics. I like how this book phrases it on page 3. Section 2 says, cataracts of the mind. Let's move on to this next section here and think about some specific attitudes. Now, not just what not to put your eye on, but the worldviews that could distract us. I like that phrase, cataracts of the mind, because if we have blurry spiritual vision, what's that going to say for our spiritual health? If we have blurry spiritual vision, we're going to have an unhealthy spiritual heart. If we have an unhealthy spiritual heart, then obviously we won't be able to serve God and live up to our full purpose there. So next in the lesson, we have 5 things that cloud our vision and cause us to lose focus. First one out of these is materialism. So materialism obviously could cloud our spiritual vision. Materialism means that we're focusing on the earthly treasures, and not just focusing on the earthly treasures, but materialism means that we define our own worth by what we have. Think about the cutthroat rat race. People that will climb over each other to get a little bit more money, a little bit more physical things, because that's how they define their own worth. Obviously, if we're seeking out the heavenly treasure, there's nothing wrong with having earthly comforts, but that is not what defines us. Let's turn to Matthew chapter 13, verse 22. The parable of the sower explanation. Jesus explains, as for what was sown among thorns, this is the one who hears the word, but the cares of the world and the deceitfulness of riches choke the word, and it proves unfruitful. So if we remember the parable of the sower, some of the seed is choked out by thorns, and some of the thorns are the cares of the world and the deceitfulness of riches. Seeking out material things, there's never enough. You always want more, more, and more. The more that you depend on your physical things to define your self-worth and your value, the less you remember that we're made in God's image and that we are so valuable that Jesus died for all of us. Some people will kill themselves working for material things and a paycheck, but forget that Jesus was killed for our souls. So let's make sure that materialism is not something that clouds our spiritual vision. And again, there's a lot of challenges around us. You got to work to survive, economic challenges, and you have to be responsible and work, but at the same time, big difference between working to provide and protect and working to give yourself imaginary value. The next, point B on page 3, selfishness. Obviously, selfishness, focusing on yourself, any greediness, putting yourself first and forgetting to love your neighbor, that will also distort our spiritual vision. We aren't going to turn there, but the book mentions the prodigal son, parable of the prodigal prodigal son in Luke chapter 15. Now that character was selfish. He was unappreciative of his family, of his father. He took what he was given, he squandered it, he wasted it. He wasn't thinking about anything except himself and his own short-term pleasures. So obviously, if we are focusing on those things, the prodigal son wasn't thinking about his spirituality until worse came to worse and he hit rock bottom. Now, if we're focusing on selfishness, obviously we aren't going to be developing ourselves and focusing on the unselfish requirements of God. If we're focused on ourselves, we won't have our eye trained on other people's needs. We won't have our eye trained on ways that we could serve and support and encourage others. Any thoughts or discussion on these 2 points so far? Materialism and selfishness. I think that's all pretty clear. Let's just keep thinking about that in terms of our spiritual vision. We got to avoid those behaviors, but also think about the big impact of our spiritual direction. Next point, prejudice. Prejudice could be one of those things that gives us a cataract of the mind. The book here describes prejudice as having the heart hardened. You have your mind made up. There's lots of ways that people could be prejudiced. There's prejudice against other people, other ethnicities, classes of people. There's prejudice against different levels of education and religions and so on. Again, we aren't going to turn here, but the book mentions Naaman in 2 Kings chapter 5. And if you recall that, Naaman was a Syrian commander with leprosy who was commanded to wash in the Jordan River 7 times. When he was told this, he scoffed and he said, "Why the Jordan River? We have better rivers here where I'm from." He was prejudiced against that. He was looking down his nose about the Judean region and the Jordan River. And it wasn't until he could overcome that prejudice that he was able to go and be cleansed of his leprosy. So again, if we think about anything in terms of prejudice, we're obviously going to have our minds clouded. If we see somebody that needs some help, we think, I don't want to help them. I don't like their class or their race or their background or anything like that. That's obviously going to keep us from living up to our full spiritual potential. The next one in the book, worry. Just read in Matthew 13, one of the thorns is the cares of the world. At the same time, worry could reduce our spiritual vision. And we'll be talking about that in a couple weeks also in Matthew chapter 6 with the do not be anxious, don't worry section of the sermon. So it is a temptation when we're worried to turn to material things or earthly things for our comfort and guidance and turn away from God. Now, why would worry cloud our vision? In times of trouble, we need to turn our eye to God and seek out encouragement and guidance from the Word. But the temptation is when we are worried or anxious about the world, be looking at short-term things to get some relief from that. So the book here says Satan wants you to focus on troubles, perceived or real, to the point that you take your eyes off of God. Sadly, the tempter often succeeds. Now, on a side point, this isn't in the book, but anybody familiar with some of the background of the word devil or Satan? There was a comment several weeks ago in one of the classes, can't remember, but about the name of the devil, Lucifer, Satan, or so on. But the book here made me think about this. Satan wants you to focus on troubles to the point that you take your eyes off of God. So in Job chapter 1, Satan is referred to as the accuser in some translations. Now the accuser, the original root words of that, the accuser is also means slanderer. The accuser or the slanderer, and our words for the devil and Satan come from translations of slanderer. So in Job, let's turn there real quick. Job chapter 1. And I promise this will relate to the eye. Let's turn to Job chapter 1. Verse 6. Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. Where it says Satan, that could also be translated as the accuser, or the slanderer, or the adversary. So imagine the throne room of God, and then the accuser is among them. So the accuser, the slanderer, what it comes down to is in Job, the devil accused Job of not following God for the right reasons, and that was part of the challenge. And then the temptation to Job was the devil, the accuser, was slandering God, saying that God would not provide for Job in his times of troubles. So there's a two-way accusation that God would be faithless, that Job would be faithless. So all that coming back to worry. You think about Satan as the accuser. Satan will accuse God to us, and Satan will tell us that God is not going to care for you. Satan accuses God and slanders God and says God will not provide. Satan slanders God and says that God will not follow up with his promise for salvation. Going back to worry in this point here with the eye. Again, the book says Satan wants you to focus on troubles. So think about that. Satan accuses God to us of not going to take care of us. And if we follow that accusation, then instead of trusting God in times of worry, we're going to trust other things, material things in times of worry. So if we follow that accusation, we turn our eyes from God in times of worry and turn our eyes to physical things, then we have just fallen prey to that accusation that Satan throws out there. Everybody with me? I don't know if I connected those dots very well or not. So again, that was a sidebar that's not in the book. But when it comes to worry, let's not fall prey to that accusation that God will not care for us. All right. Did I lose anybody there? I like the book of Job. I might have to do a study on that sometime. All right. Final point on page 4 on E, a lack of faith. Obviously, a lack of faith is going to affect our spiritual vision. If we trust in God one day and then our eyes wander when we put our trust in other things and then we're going back and forth with what we focus on, that shaky faith is going to have our vision all over the place. The book here calls it double vision. In the book of James, let's turn there and read a description there. James chapter 1, verse 6, talking about praying. Let's back up to verse 5. If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God, who gives generously to all without a reproach, and it will be given him. But let him ask in faith with no doubting, for the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea that is driven and tossed by the wind. So think about that faith. Focusing on different things if we got shaky faith. Verse 7, for that person must not suppose that he will receive anything from the Lord. He is a double-minded man, unstable in all his ways. So, again, James says, if you lack wisdom, pray to God, but do so with sound faith. Coming back to the eye, if we're going to get wisdom from God, we've got to focus. Focus on the right things and not be looking back and forth and say, I think I'll get my wisdom from God. I'm going to focus on the Bible today. And then the next day, I'm going to get my wisdom from somewhere else and be looking all over the place. As James says, that will lead somebody to be unstable in all of their ways. All right, any thoughts on that? A lack of faith or shaky faith will give us spiritual double vision. Okay. All right. All right. moving on. Let's see, in the interest of time, let's read about let's turn to Mark chapter 8. We're going to skip a little bit in the interest of time. Mark chapter 8. Now let's read about one of Jesus' miracles regarding sight and take a practical lesson from that also. Mark chapter 8, verses 22. We've been talking about our eyes and what we focus on. Let's talk about the physical sight. Mark chapter 8, verse 22. And they came to Bethsaida, and some people brought to him a blind man and begged him to touch him. And he took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the village. And when he had spit on his eyes and laid his hands on him, he asked, "Do you see anything?" And he looked up and said, "I see people, but they look like trees walking." Then Jesus laid his hands on his eyes again, and he opened his eyes. His sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. And he sent him to his home, saying, "Do not enter the village." So I think this is a story about a physical miracle where Jesus was restoring sight, but a little bit of conversation in here. We think about this spiritually. God will restore our sight. He will help us to see what we need to focus on. Jesus isn't concerned about our physical sight, obviously, as much as our spiritual sight. And so God will restore our sight when it's needed. But when Jesus was doing this miracle, it's not like he didn't get it right the first time. He did this process twice with a blind man. He could have gotten it right the first time, no doubt about that. But I think there's a point being made. Jesus first asked the question, "Do you see anything?" The blind man could see a little bit more, but it was blurry. And then Jesus did further cleansing and restored his sight all the way. And it says that he saw everything clearly. So our sight being restored spiritually, if we turn back to God, it's not just a one-time, boom, you're done, you have good eyesight and you have good spiritual vision. It's a continuous process. We need to ask ourselves, what are we seeing? Do we see clearly, or do we see everything still kind of blurry? So going back to James in Ephesians chapter 1, the prayers for strong faith, the prayers for the eyes of the heart to be enlightened, it's not a one-time thing. It's continuously try to improve your spiritual eyesight. We can't do that alone. We can't do that without God's Word and also the encouragement of each other. So as we study, that's a good time to be sharpening up our own spiritual eyesight and our understanding. We could help each other focus. We could help each other guide our way, make sure our hearts are dedicated and following the right path. That's about the end of the notes that I had, and we've got about 2 minutes left in class. Any comments or suggestions? I think what we need to do is get everybody to sit together in one group, have lots of sugar cookies and coffee, and we'll make sure we get some good discussion moving forward. So I think we'll wrap that class up for now. Next Sunday we'll get to lesson 2, which is about loyalty in verse 24, serving one master, not two. Hope this class is beneficial to everybody. And let's make sure that we're all studying together and being ready to learn from each other. So we'll wrap up the class for this morning. Thanks, everybody.